We'll see if it crashes again. I apologize for those of you that, right, the recording ended and everything crashed. The actual computer crashed in the classroom. Technology is not something that I align well with, so I apologize for that. But we were talking about these theories of the modern state. We talked about how war causes sort of camaraderie, sort of people to bind together. We quoted some examples, we discussed those, right? And this becomes the historical example, right? This becomes the most common theory. And in fact, the reason why it's going to come up a lot is because a lot of authors, even today, right, even in the 21st century, argue that war helps you sort of formulate a state, right? That you need some sort of external threat in order to build a modern state, because that external threat causes taxation and centralization, right? You have to raise taxes to defend the state, and through that process, you have to start organizing and centralizing power. And as you're taxing and centralizing power, you start creating a national identity, right? French national identity, English national identity, or United Kingdom national identity with all those little separate pieces, right? That they have some United Kingdom shared national identity and then separate pieces. Actually, there's a strong national identity, right? There's language barriers and Northern Ireland, right? Northern Ireland is trying always to leave the United Kingdom, so that there's always a secessionist movement. But that process, that theoretical process, becomes a big foundation of the arguments we're going to discuss, right? I have to tax to raise an army. I need to centralize power. I need to bring all these things in. So I'm going to start creating one functional identity, or, right, I need to convince these elites to actually fund my war making. And so in that process, I have to make deals with them about providing services, or about having a functional government in what we consider a government today, right, that provides services, that protects them, that does certain things for them, including patronage, subsidies, things like that. So that's the most common theory that always sort of sets up. And then we never get too far away from sort of this historical turn of modernization, industrialization, and urbanization, right? And these are not disconnected, right? That as you start moving towards the 19th century, you start getting city centers. And when you start to have city centers, and the article that we read is about 10,000 people or more in one area, one of the things that we see is that you start to have specialization of labor before you have industrialization, right? The blacksmith is the most obvious example, right? If you're living in a small town of about like 60, 80 people, remember this could be 1700s. So if you're living in a small village and there's 60, 80 people, it doesn't make sense to have a blacksmith. You can't have someone work as a blacksmith because okay, hold on. Christina, your mic's on. Thank you. Okay. I don't want to mute anyone because then you can't actually speak, but so what we see is, right, if a blacksmith's in a very small town, they don't have a job. But if we have a bigger and larger town, then horseshoes, right, that can become your whole job, right, just making horseshoes and making other metal goods, right? And so you start to have specialization with urbanization, and then as you start to specialize, those skills become more and more useful, you have higher productivity, you start to see wages increase, and so wage and production increases start to become part of this norm before we ever have the Industrial Revolution, right, the steam power and all the other things that come along with it. And so this ties in very well to the war pressure because it also has that contract theory, which we're going to talk about again later, right? That if you start taxing me and you want to take taxes from me, and I live in a city, right? One of the things that happens when you live in a city is you need a lot more services, right? Taking care of trash becomes very important, right? We see this dramatic change, right? Just because if you start living in crowded spaces, you can't just dump your trash to a compost pile, or you can't just put it in your back lot. You live right next to each other. So getting rid of waste and trash and other materials like that becomes very important. And the last part, which it might come up in sociology classes and other places like that, is what we call Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or sometimes Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because Maslow's not, he's sort of the English version of his last name, right? That's not important. What is important is his hierarchy of needs. When we go into this next slide, right, we see that this is an argument that's made that most people, most scientists will sort of buy into, is that first are your physiological needs, right? You need to be able to eat, breathe, and sleep, right? You need to not be freezing to death or starving to death, right? You need to be able to meet your basic human needs, right, when it comes to like those things in order to just live your life. And if you don't have those, you don't move up, right? If you're like, I'm starving, you don't move up to, I need to be safe. You're like, I'm going to die, right? Starvation is going to kill me, or, right, I'm going to die from dehydration, or I'm in the water drowning, I have to get out of this. So this has to be met, right? The way this pyramid works, right, is that this has to be met, and then the next step is your safety needs, right? That you need to have, right, that your personal security means no one is physically harming. You're not going to be attacked by another person, right? You have to meet those needs, and then employment and resources, right? So first, I have to have food right now. And then I have to have a job so I can pay for food in the future. And then the next thing is love and belonging, and sometimes it's considered community, right? Where you have to have connections to the people around you, right? That you have to have those things. And most of the time, if you have food and water and shelter, and you have a job, then you'll end up having sort of friends and family and sort of a communal connection, right? These all kind of build up to each other. And then the next part is esteem, right? And there are other terms that we use for this hierarchy of needs. This doesn't have the best image. The easiest image that I could use to demonstrate. And so this esteem part is where you start saying, I want to be free to do the things that I want. I want to be respected as an individual. I want as people to say, you're a person that has rights, right? And this becomes really different when you're sort of building up. Remember, in an urbanization setting, you're starting to get food security, right? Food is more available because you have all these specialties. So you have a farmer and a grocer and sort of building these things up where you can just go to a store and buy food, right? Because you have sort of an entire system that's built that's creating food for that, right? And so instead of having food insecurity, and not food insecurity in sort of economic sense, but just there's no food around, right? So now if you work, you can buy food, right? And so now you start demanding more involvement in government, or at least that if the government's going to tax you, they have to sort of give something back, right? Before you say, I want to be part of government, you say, if you're going to tax me, you also have to protect me. Or if you're going to tax me, you have to start dealing with the trash that's on the street, right? Sort of basic services thing is part of this esteem. And then last is self-actualization, right? And in this one, they're like the most that you can be, but for us, for political scientists, the most you can be in a government is involved in the government, right? A government of the people for the people, right? So this very top part of the hierarchy of needs is, okay, I get to live my life, I have food and shelter, and I have a family, and we have a house that's protected, and police that protect us from harm. I want all of those things met, right? Now, police objective, right? That's in an American sense, police brutality is a very big issue. But remember, we're talking globally. And a police force means something very different, or a security force means something different in other parts of the world. So I have all of these things met. Now I want to be in the government. And I may not want to be a representative, but I want to have a say. I want to have a vote, right? And so this natural hierarchy of needs, as your life gets better, you're going to want more and more say over the things that happen to you because you meet these basic needs. And so now you're saying, I want to be involved in the government. And that can be a really powerful aspect of how we get to these modern states that become representative regimes because of the natural order of these things. Right? Because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I say Maslow or not, but that's not necessarily the right pronunciation either. So what are we missing? Right? What's missing from this modern state, right? One of the things that's missing is that when we talk about this, the reason why people are very critical of the French and the English model of using conflict and contract theory and taxation centralizes the state is what is missing is ethnicity and religion, right? That there isn't a discussion of diversity. There isn't a discussion of different religions, right? Because France and England are not diverse. They're not very diverse. Now when we look at sort of When we think about England today, it's a little more, we would consider a little more diverse, but remember until about the 19th century, the people, anyone who's not white in those states aren't considered citizens, they don't have rights, right? So it's always ignoring ethnicity and religion in these aspects, and so that damages the argument. And so before the 20th century, we argue that most states are homogenous. Even if they have a small non-white population, that non-white population is excluded from the government, right? The indigenous peoples in Australia, right, or France, right? France excludes. They actually take over Algiers for a time and make that French territory, but those people are part of France but are not French citizens. But Algiers is not its own state, so they're not a citizen of any country, right? So you have those aspects, right, where people are just not represented, but we consider them to be homogenous until about the 20th century. Remember, homogenous means that they share sort of ethnic and religious qualities, right? The French people have one sort of shared ethnicity and religion, right? And Catholics, white Catholics, right? And so it's not until later we have this switch. So if states are diverse, right, as many African states are, they're diverse by the nature of their borders not being decided based on ethnicity or history, but by foreign powers, right? The colonial rule makes boxes, makes little squares of all the states, and that's not really fitting with their natural borders, right? So if you have this forced diversity, right, that's set on by outside foreign powers, and that's going to create a problem that isn't really discussed by these theories. And then a critique that we're going to hear come up here and there is, do we really need war pressure, right? And this has two sides to this argument. One is that there's this really sort of commonplace argument about necessity, right? If you need something to be better or to improve, then you're more likely to improve it, right? Necessity being the mother of invention or innovation, right? Depending on the time period that you're discussing it. And I'm not quoting anyone, I'm just, right, this is a very sort of common saying. This argument has been used a lot historically, that if you need to be better, like this demand for it, right? That when we talked about like getting something from the government, does that make you weaker because you don't try as hard, right? Those arguments don't have any like scientific data. I mean, there are studies, but for the most part, when they say them, they're just an expression that people say, right? That in hardship, you sort of at your best. That's not necessarily true in many cases. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not going to mute you. Oh my god. Why? Okay, you guys have to just use the chat because I muted all of you because I don't know where that audio input's coming from. So you have that one side that's saying you have to have this pressure to do better, but is that really true, or is it just that the states that happen to survive, right? For a whole host of reasons, right? We know a Spanish Armada was sunk by a random storm, right? There are always all these chaotic factors that we may not classify or code right? And so is it really necessity and war pressure sort of forming these consolidated states? Or is it just that there happened to be a couple of states that survived, and they also were the states that consolidated, right? It may be good for war, but is it good for state building, right? And how do we know that, or is that just the story of the winners or the survivors, right? History is always sort of told by the winners, right, or by the victors. And so, right, is that really theoretical accurate, or is that just the story we get from the people who won the conflicts, won the wars? And so we're always concerned about war pressure. Is that really necessary? And then the last part is centralization, the only way, that should say way, to create a modern state, right? Really? Okay, that's a typo. I'm not gonna get into too much, so I don't want computer crash again. So, is this the only way? Because we know that there are a lot of states that don't have decentralized governments, right? A confederacy is problematic. And in the United States, we think of confederacies as sort of the South. But remember, before we were the United States, under the United States Constitution, we were under the Articles of Confederation, right? And I'm not supporting like American Confederacy. That's not the point. The point is a Confederate government is different from a federal government, right? A federal government is top down, right? The federal government is above the state governments. That's a federal government, right? Federal government, the national government is up here, and then the state and regional governments are below it, right? And this power structure is here. In a Confederate government, right, not an American Confederacy, but in a Confederate government as a regime type, right? A Confederate government as a structure, right? All the states are here, and then below it is this weak sort of national government. And in a Confederate government, the lowest part of the national government is the lowest part because it's ruled on by each of the states. Now, we can already see if you have all these independent states dictating national government, right, there are a lot of problems if they don't agree, right? So when we have those issues, a Confederate government isn't very common, it's not as functional, but it could exist, right? It could exist in a modern state. In fact, we would consider, right, the Confederacy that existed for a short period of time, it was a modern state. It worked in a modern state, right? The American Confederacy, right? Not modern in the sense of providing services to all its people, obviously because of slavery, right? But, not to diminish that in any way, but a Confederate government can function. Logically, it would have some problems, but can you be a modern state and not be centralized, right? Is that really, do they have to be connected, right? The other thing is there are loose associations. Some states don't have complete control, right? Several states have autonomous zones or regions that aren't as controlled by their central government. And then, of course, small states, right? If you have a microstate, a state that has less than 500,000 people, so if your state has less than 500,000 people, do you really need as much formulation of government? Because you don't have, right, if you're in I don't know if there are any, like, Turks and Caicos maybe, or, right, there's Trinidad, and it might be over 500,000 now, but many of them are so small that you don't really need a centralized government because when problems come up, you can just solve them as a larger group. Or, right, when you think about a small population, like a small town solving its problems, right, the mayor might just solve that problem, right? Right, the mayor might just say, oh, there's a pothole, I'm going to get the services to go out and fix that pothole. But if you're in a massive sort of urban center, right, and you need a pothole fixed, well, there's a whole schedule, and right, the potholes, 300 potholes before that have to be fixed before I can get to that pothole, right? And urgency of potholes, right, that is, as you grow, that economy of scale also has negative aspects where everything requires agency and bureaucracy and sort of scheduling. And so do we really always need this centralization to create a modern state? The paper, I know I got asked this question, the paper submission is available. Is this just gonna work? Look at that, okay. So you should be seeing the new section on paths to the modern state. So I introduced that first part to really cover the larger things, right? So now let's get into the specifics of this article. We're going to finish at 11, only because I know we cut a lot of time in this class. The second lecture for the other reading is quite short, because I already talked about this. I don't need you to learn the statistics aspects. I just need you to learn the context of the material. And so the material that's provided is not as much because there's a lot of statistics in it. And when you're reading through it, you can say, okay, I'm getting this point from, and I'm getting this point. I don't really see the statistics, but I'm going to look at the arguments that are being made. So there's not as much to cover. But just between IT and everything that at 11 I'm going to run out of steam. I know that I'm losing my voice, and I don't want to be unclear. I want to make sure I'm still projecting as we're having this discussion. So state building is historical context. Remember, this is before the industrial era. And so it is intra-elite driven. So what does that mean? It means that instead of having elites in France and elites in England interact, right? The French elites are dealing with their state and interacting with each other, and the English elites are dealing with their state and interacting with each other. So, right, you have just these small elite groups, and they're not really talking to other elite groups, right? Think if it's 1450 and you live in the United Kingdom, or if you live in England at the time, right, you're not going to travel to France all the time to communicate because it's such a difficult journey, right? It becomes easier over time, but it starts as a very difficult journey. So the only elites that you're going to interact with are the ones that are close to you, right, within your own state. And so when you don't have high levels of communication, and there's always this threat of war because you don't really know what the other states are doing, a lot of times what you end up with is high levels of uncertainty. And when it comes to states interacting with each other, when there's high levels of uncertainty, you end up with a lot of wars, right? And you have wars for several reasons. Some of them because it's harder to interact and communicate with other states, right? Remember that translators aren't as common, and right that clear communication lines aren't there between governments, right? That there are all these problems, but also there are all these economic reasons to go to war, right? You want a colony, or you want to take over some place where a mine exists for wealth extraction. And wars have always been sort of limited economic benefit. If you go to war and your opponent is very weak, and then you steal everything from them, right? This is sort of the British model until the 19th century, 20th century, until about 1880, I want to say, right? The colonial period, it was very beneficial because they would defeat a military opponent in a colonial state, right, at a colony, and then they would take over and they would just extract wealth. They would use the population that was there to take all the spices and minerals and pull it out and bring it back to England for some economic benefit. But when you're fighting against another power, when France and England are fighting each other, it's very economically draining, right? It really drains in. And so sometimes you drain into that and you have to go fight a war, a smaller war with a colony to fund your bigger war, right, with another power. And so you have very clear systemic differences in the system. And so obviously you have colonies. You have slavery, right? Very few people in the world are considered sort of human. And you have a lot of people who are considered less than human. And this is not a subject we're going to really get too much into in comparative politics because it is more of a international relations topic. But who gets to be human is a whole conversation, right? Who do we consider human really changes over this time period, right? Remember that until the 20th century, maybe a little earlier in some places, right, until like 1919 to 1924, women are considered property under the law. In almost all states, right, they're considered property under the law. Right? Children are considered property, right? People who are not white are often considered property. In the state of Nevada, right, if you weren't white, you couldn't testify in court against a white person. So who is human and who is considered human is this evolving concept, right, that has a very shameful past, but not just for Americans, but for many other places. And I'm not being protective of American history. It's a horrific, right? The entire history is horrific and has all of these terrible things that were done in the namesake of developing our sort of westward manifest destiny, right? Horrible, horrible things. No defense whatsoever of that. The next part is empire building, right? If you're France and England, who really become the empires, the colonial powers, right? The Dutch and the Spanish, they have their sort of roles, but eventually it becomes the French and the English, which become very, very powerful empires. And they have to constantly be setting up a position where they can defend against the other power, right? And we'll talk about this later, how that rivalry in Latin America is the same as sort of this arms race that we see in the Soviet Union versus the United States, right? This sort of colonial empire behavior when it comes to France and England, where if you have one power that's threatening you, you're always counterbalancing and you're always trying to do better than the other, but it causes both of you to expand in your military and your empire as much as you possibly can, often to the detriment of domestic politics. So this paper talks about tax revenue, and they have a representative body, but one of the things that really matters is they sort of unified under tons of silver and grams of silver. So this is how much silver per person, and this is how much silver total. So this isn't just a control, right? This per capita is always just a control for population. Per capita means divided by the number of people, right? So what they find is that in both the size of the economy and the size of the economy divided by the number of people, there's this really big increase in England and France, right? Pre-industrial, right? The Industrial Revolution sort of changes the entire system. But even before that, England and France are seeing huge strides in the size of their economy and the real wages of the individuals in that system. And so this becomes part of the question that we're going to discuss, which is, what does that lead to? How does that impact, right? And the other part is that we treat often tax revenue as state capacity. Even today, if we talked about how much capacity was in a state, right? How much can the state do? We would talk about the revenue streams that they have. How much money are they taking in, and how much do they already owe to debt, right? So this is one of the things that is really starting to become an issue in a lot of places, right? There are a lot of heavily indebted states, right? The heavily indebted poor countries, the HIPCs, right? That these are countries that are really struggling because they take in like 100 million in revenue. It's just numbers that I'm making up. I'm not using them, but as an example, not as a theoretical example, not as a real case. So if you're a small state and you take in 100 million in revenue, that's taxes, rents, everything, but your loans that you have to pay out are $95 million, then you only have $5 million to run your entire state, right? Which is not enough to run a state appropriately, right? So the capacity really is tied to your revenue streams and your expenditures, right? That's really how we define state capacity. There are other ways to define it, but they're not really for this course. So you're taking in the revenue, but you're spending on very specific things before we talk about modern state. You have to build an army, right? Every time there's a conflict, you have to build a new army. Not that, right? Not just the new weapons, but new soldiers, right? You can't afford, until about the 19th century, you can't afford a standing army. You can't afford to have an army the whole time, right? You have to send those people back into the workforce, and then when you need them, pull them back out of the workforce, right? Protect the regime from domestic threats. So we talk about this in both articles, but if you have elites, you have to protect it. And landowning elites need certain protections because they're domestic, they're farmers or they're workers of the land. Sometimes they're going to revolt, and the state government is going to need to come in and push down that revolt. If you have someone who owns a business and property, right, you need enough of a coercive apparatus that you can stop them from getting robbed and murdered as they walk down the street, right? If you have a very wealthy elite and they don't have anywhere to put their money that they feel safe, right, they're going to take that outside of your state, and it's going to make things much worse. So you have to enforce rule of law, and then you have to collect revenue, right? And so when we talk about tax revenue versus per capita tax revenue, I was going to get into a lot of this, but the important part is that we expect the economy to grow with population. If I have 10 million people, my economy should be smaller than if I had 15 million people. So 15 million people is just a larger economy. That's very, very simple, right? It kind of is problematic because we've always had this population growth causes economic growth, but we're sort of hitting that point where I think there's 8 billion people on the planet, where now we are reaching this point of sort of diminishing return, right? Yes, the economy will grow if we have more people, right? That's just the nature of mathematics, right? If you have more people in the workforce and they're having more children, they're going to consume more resources, which they're going to spend more money, and we're going to have more employees, and so the size of the entire economy gets larger. But at some point, right, the amount of resources that are available are going to diminish, right? And so one of these things, actually, I'm going to put this edit into tool so we can. So there's this argument, right? We already talked about innovation, right, or invention, right? So the people who are fans of innovation, they're like, whenever we run into a problem, Like when we did run into a problem, right? This is, right? So if we only grew organic food, we couldn't feed the planet, right? Genetically modified food, even though it has a whole host of issues that we can talk about, genetically modified food increases crop yields. So there are some scientists like 30, 40 years ago that started going to places where there just wasn't enough food, modifying the crops genetically, not Monsanto and sort of corporate business, but just going as part of a research group and going to these communities that didn't have enough food and then just changing and modifying their crops so that they could feed their population that year, right? And there might be consequences later, right? But the arguments of the scientists at the time were, right now they're starving. And we're going to stop them from starving right now. Remember, go back to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're going to stop them from starving right now, and then we're going to figure out what we can do. So genetically modified organisms really did allow millions of people to survive that would normally have starved. Obviously, that's a problem because there's a big organic movement in the United States, but the answer to starvation and population growth, right, was innovation. That was one answer that we can get that we talked about, necessity being the mother of all invention. The other is this Malthusian argument. Malthusianism is a theory, so Malthusian argument. And so the Malthusian argument is just scarcity. As population grows, there's going to be less and less resources to go around, right? If you live in a house and you have 2 children and you have a set income and a set amount of resources, and then you have a 3rd child, now what used to be divided by 4 people is going to be divided by 5 people. And so Malthusian, the author's name is Malthus, the last name is Malthus. And his argument was just that as population grows, scarcity increases, it's going to be harder to provide for people. So these are 2 groups. Now, most people fall into this innovation, right? We can always figure out a new solution, right? Technology and science and, right, American exceptionalism, there'll always be a solution. This was sort of, most people would say this was discredited because you have GMOs, you have things like this. The only real place that Malthusian plays now is in climate change, because the amount of fresh water available isn't just not enough for the population, but it's actually dwindling, right? There's this thing called renew rate. There's supply and then the renew rate, right? There's so much water that you have, but each year more water comes in to the stream that you pull the water from. But if you pull too much of the supply, the banks will dry up and your actual refresh rate will decline as well. Right? That's how you get rivers that disappear or streams that no longer exist, right? And so Malthus's big contribution right now is that environmental shifts are making it so we have less and less resources for increasingly more people. And so these 2 arguments start to really play a difference in, are we talking about how do we make things better, right? Can we, not how to, but can we make things better, or are we running into more and more scarcity as we grow in population size? And so this isn't something that I want you to spend too much time with. But these are 2 different approaches, right? This is whatever problems we have, we'll fix them. This is, right, we are sort of running towards a cliff, right, that we can't fix, right? So this is the pessimistic approach, and this is an optimistic approach. Okay. So you have these scarcity issues, you have, right, this sort of tax revenue to state capacity, right? The state is how much revenue it can bring in and how much that revenue can be spent on services or defense, right? So when we're talking about this, why is it so important to think about wars? And why war is typically put in the IR category, we're just going to spend a minute talking about it. There's a pretty common path that you follow in conflict. So if you're a state and you don't like the way things are, you want to change the status quo. And status quo just means how things are right now. So if you want to change the status quo, you want to take over territory, you want to control a shipping lane, whatever it is, you say, I'm going to do this. And you send say you send a few ships, not a fleet, not a war fleet, but you send a few ships and you start setting up checkpoints and taxing ships that are going through that lane for your state. Now, obviously, other powerful states, they don't want their, right, if you're England, they don't want their French ships paying to travel this sea lane. So then that powerful state tries to find a suitable agreement. Now, there are a couple of appeasement. Appeasement is when it seems like one state is much more powerful, so you give them something small in the hopes that you don't have to give them more. And appeasement rarely works, right? Appeasement is, right, World War II sort of showed appeasement to be not as effective, in part because if I give you something small and I don't give anything in return, then you might think, oh, I can just keep pressing for more. Because obviously I have some advantage, I should press that advantage. And if you're a state, remember, states don't operate on morality. This is something that you'll get if you ever read Machiavelli's The Prince, right? States don't operate on morality. They operate on this sort of justification of rule, right? That whatever is best for the state is what they should do. Even if it would seem immoral, whatever's right, Machiavelli would say, you have to do what's best for the state. And survival is so important that you have to press every advantage, right? So you always want to do that. So appeasement doesn't really fit with that logic that we talk about. The other is you could keep the status quo. You could say, hey, you're going to start charging my ships, or we're going to get into it. And then the other person says, I don't really want to fight this fight, so let's just go back to the way things were. And the other is side payments, right? Side payments is this really great solution where I'm going to let you keep charging ships. Every ship that comes through the sea lane, you can keep charging. But because I don't want my French ships passed, right, you're going to let my French ships go through. You can charge the Dutch ships, you can charge the Spanish ships, but when you see a French flag flying, you just let that one go, right? So that's sort of a side payment. Or, right, we both control the sea lane, and we sort of split the revenue that comes from it, right? You control one and I control the other end, and we both sort of just split these checkpoints. Now, if you can't come to an agreement, right, then do we go to war? Because if someone says, I'm going to attack you, one of the things that states can do is say, we surrender. You can just take over. Now, they might, if we're talking pre-1800s, right, they might just get slaughtered outright, a whole host of issues. But if you know you're going to lose a war, we have seen this quite a bit in the past, if you know you're going to lose a war, often you'll just surrender preemptively to say, I don't want bloodshed, right, you could come in, right? And the United States and the Soviet Union did this mostly in the 20th century, where they would go to a state, the state had nowhere near enough power to stop what was happening, and so it would just allow this foreign occupation and these sort of proxy wars that exist. And a proxy war is where, right, we talked about this a lot during the Cold War, right, that the Soviets and the United States, they would both pick a side, and they would have those two sides fight, right, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They would have them fight, or, right, obviously we engaged in Vietnam. But in each one of those aspects, right, we would pick a side, and the fight was between those places and not the powers. And so that's why you have a proxy, because a proxy is just someone as a stand-in. Then each state raises an army, right? So pre-20th century, you draft everyone in, you build new boats, you make a new army. And then when you finish that war, right, that conflict, that war, when you come back, you break those ships down, you make, plowshares, you make farming equipment out of the weapons, you take the wood and you make buildings out of the ships, right, and you sort of break it all down. So nothing really stays because it might be 5, 10 years, and you can't afford to maintain that for that period of time. So in these centralized states, as we move forward, one of the things that we're going to notice is that the administrators, the bureaucrats, the tax collectors, they start making more and more and more, especially in France and England. The wages that they receive, the amount of income they had, starts to get really high because as the wages of urban workers go up, they can collect more and more, and then they get more organized, more bureaucratic, and they start paying themselves a lot better to control certain regions, right? And this exceeds other areas, right? One of the reasons that France and England is considered to have centralized power faster is because tax collection and the wages of administrators was much higher compared to the wages and of administrators and workers, urban workers in Asian states, right? And the whole continent of Asia, right? Even when we're talking about sort of West Asia getting into the Middle East, right, the subcontinent of India, and then of course this historical, what is historically considered sort of the Asian states, right? The sort of China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So we see this, right, unique aspect. So a lot of people would say that's unique. That points to something that is different about France and England and these Western states that helps explain why they consolidated, right? And that's based on this war aspect, right? They needed tax collection. So war pressure builds into tax collection. Tax collection is state capacity. And so this allows them to explain why Western states, Western European states, were able to consolidate and sort of become modern states at a faster rate at an early time period. So then we get into these 4 questions. One is war pressure a real thing, which we'll talk about not only for the rest of today, but also into next week. War pressure, what does it have? Does it help create this sort of central taxation and revenue capacity? Right? Does urbanization, right? Does moving into the cities help that? And then are authoritarian regimes and representative regimes better at this fiscal policy, raising revenue, taxation, centralized government? So a quick note on the dependent variables and the independent, right? In this article, they use per capita tax revenue, right? Tax revenue divided by the number of people, and then, really? And then the independent variables, war casualties, urbanization, representation over taxes, and representation activity. This is something that you'll talk about in Political Science 231 if you take it about how do we define a war is something that I don't think you need to know, right? It's something for another course. Like if you take my Political Science 231, we're going to talk a lot about how do you define a war, but here the important part is that they're just defining it as the number of deaths in a specific war. And so they use this research, right? And then they make this argument that wars create a burden for the state, right? And then that's why you get this economic drain, and then you need consolidation and taxation. And then urbanization connected to these economic shifts. We should already talk about specialization of labor, right? Economy of scale when you have a city, right? So you can have people that are just doing one job. And then the needs of the people start to really change when they live in a city center or in a city. So the easy answer, right, is war and urbanization, right? War and urbanization are very easy to explain, right? We've talked about this already, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But higher taxation, more centralized state, right? Urbanization, specialization, efficiency, more centralized state. You start bringing in more tax revenue. All of these things are very clear. They work in a very clear way. So this is the easy part, right? We can point to actual historical cases, right? We can point to these theories and we can see them in practice, right? So these are not difficult. The hard part is regime type. If you look at these 2 different things, there are theoretical arguments that support an authoritarian regime being better at taxation and centralization, especially in context of when you have war pressure, when you're at war or you're about to go to war. And some of the arguments are very effective, both in the theory and the historical examples, that representative regimes, I apologize for mixing those 2 words up, are better at taxation, right, and centralization. Right? These are different arguments. They're conflict, right? They can't both be true because they're making different arguments. Now, the representative regime runs off contract theory. And contract theory just means that elites agree to pay taxes in exchange for something, right? Why is the English government, right? Why is the English government and the king accepting the sort of new change where the elites have some say over government, right? Why do they go to representative regime so early? Because England has a funding problem and they're worried they're going to lose a war. So they agreed to allow this sort of legislative branch to exist because the legislative branch is an exchange from the elites for better taxation, right? So the king needs more money to win the war, to survive, right? The elites say no unless we can have representation. England becomes one of the first modern democracies, right, after the ancient Greeks. Right, ancient Greeks, ancient democracy, right? One of the first Modern democracies becomes England because the king has to answer to these people in order to get the funding for his war effort. Now, authoritarian regimes, right, if you need money and you're not willing to provide, right, then it might be easier just to be an authoritarian regime and force them to give you money, right? There are different contexts where you say, all that matters is existing. So I don't need to talk to you. I don't need to make a deal with you where you get something out of it. I just need to survive. And so an authoritarian regime might be more successful because they're more likely to survive a war. If we look at representative regimes, sort of early democracy prototypes, right? Early forms of democracy coming about in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. They were typically very fragile because they didn't have that coercive apparatus to raise funds for a war effort. And so it was much more likely for a democracy, the state of a democracy, to stop existing. Right? Survival is, does your country, does your state exist after a war? Right? And so representative regimes and early democracies were being taken over by authoritarian regimes and stop existing. So they were much more fragile. Does that mean that they're not as good about becoming a modern state and moving towards that modern state type because they couldn't survive? Right? It doesn't matter what you're trying to get to if you don't exist afterwards. So the authoritarian regimes have an argument, the representative regime arguments are there, and so this does not compete. So what really starts to explain this? The first part is that it's not all the same. And what you have to look at is who are the elites in different societies, right? And so if you have a highly urbanized society, right, and you have war pressure, then a representative regime makes more sense. But if you have an agrarian society with landowning elites, right, then an authoritarian regime makes more sense. So it's not just one is better than the other, it's under what conditions is one better than the other, right? It's under what conditions, right? A penguin is a much more effective animal in the Arctic, but a hummingbird, right, or whatever, a crow, is much more effective here in Las Vegas, right? It's not that one is better than the other, it's that the conditions in which they find them, they excel at, right? And so in an agrarian society, you have landowning elites. Landowning elites don't want a centralized government. They don't want it under any condition, right? In many cases, you coming in and centralizing government and being very involved in the landowning elites' behavior is not that much different from you losing the war, right? And so in an agrarian society, if you want to have a representative regime, those elites will resist any type of consolidation, and it'll be harder for you to deal with, to create state capacity. So if you have an agrarian regime with limited urbanization, and you're facing a war effort and you're trying to survive and sort of build capacity, an authoritarian regime makes more sense. Because you're never going to get the landowning elites to agree, so you might as well just force their hand, right? If survival is your ultimate goal. On the other hand, in an urban society, right, merchant elites, right, the business class, right, this new sort of developing bourgeoisie, they can move money around. They can hide money, right? The land is there, right? You can't hide land, and you can't hide what's on the land. So if you're in an agrarian society, the tax collector can come by and say, look, you have this much land, you should pay this much in taxes. If you're in that business class and someone says, you're running this factory, it's making this much, you say, no, it's not really making that much, it's making less. Or if they say, we're going to tax you 20%, you just take that money and you ship it off somewhere, or you hide it, right? And so it limits coercion, right? Tax collectors can't force their hand, but also it makes them more willing to exchange. If you're able to hide your money or move your money around or protect your money in a number of ways, then when you communicate with a government that's in control, that's in power, right, you will often say to that right, and I will exchange the money that I have for something. You can't just take it, because I can move it around more than you can take it, right? And so, because you can't take it, I'm willing to make a deal with you. And so what we see in our historic examples are the difference between England and France. And we talk about these a lot because they sort of really hit the marks that we want them to hit. So England becomes a representative government early on. And it becomes this sort of headache, right? That it's a rural, it's still very agrarian society when it gets to representative government. Because the king's in such a bad position in the 15th and 16th century. The king's in such a bad position that he gives quite a bit of his power to the elites, right? And because he gives so much power to the elites early on, the representative regime really becomes this headache where the king can't get his people to be organized. He can't really control his elites, and he hasn't been an authoritarian for so long, even though he's still a monarch. He hasn't had complete power for so long that representative regimes are this big headache. But then all the people go from living in the farmlands and out in the woods, and they start moving to cities, right? In part because you start having blacksmiths, and you start having millers, and you start having people that do specific jobs, and they can sort of come together and use the resources that are coming from the farms and produce textiles and fabrics and shirts and crafting skills, right? And better at making certain aspects. And then all of a sudden, you have an urban population and a representative regime, and so contract theory creates this asset in England, right? The representative regime becomes this beneficial tool because whenever the king wants something, right, for survival, he can say, I know I can't take it from you, but if you're willing to give it to me, I can make more concessions. And so it creates this hundreds of years long, right? 400 or 500 years, over the course of centuries, right, the king and the monarchy gives away more and more and more power until finally the United Kingdom sort of completely transitions, where the monarchs are sort of just figureheads, right? They don't really do anything, but they still have a stipend and Buckingham Palace and whatever. But the government is then run by the people, right, by elected representatives. On the other hand, right, that France has this authoritarian regime. They don't really, right, the Russian Revolution we talked about when we read Scotch Bowl. But the important part is that you have this rural population. You don't see it urbanize right away, but then when it does urbanize, you still have the landowning elites and the authoritarian regime. And so that urbanization creates this problem because the landowning elites don't have the power that they used to have, but also there's no contract theory. There's no exchange of taxation for goods and services because you don't have that regime where you can say I'm willing to trade for those things. And so while urbanization becomes this boon for England, where they do better after urbanization because they have a representative regime, France does much worse because they have an authoritarian regime but have become urbanized, and their elites are still in a sort of historical context and haven't moved into the business class. And that's why you see such a violent revolution, that it had this authoritarian regime that had never sort of lost power and negotiated with its populace until you have this violent upheaval and sort of the French Revolution and this, like, let's just throw all of it away and go full-fledged democracy, right? Brotherhood, fraternity, liberty, all of the things that come from the French Revolution, where it really says we're going to become a representative regime because we had to violently overthrow this authoritarian regime, right? And so you have those aspects. So England and France really don't just explain the war pressure aspects, but also how you can be very different under certain contexts. How urbanization can be a different factor based on which type of regime you're under. And so that really helps answer that part of the question, right? What is the effective, what is the best solution, right? It's not always best, but best under what context? Right, let me do that. So the last part I'm only going to introduce, and then we're going to finish early. I have to go yell at a bunch of people who aren't doing their jobs. Not you guys, just people who should have done that. And so I'm really just going to talk about this, is that war pressure really is this argument. War pressure as a theory about how states are formed is very widely accepted all over the place. People really buy into this, but then you start seeing, right, what we start seeing is that in Latin America, in the Middle East, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, this just doesn't work, right? State formation is not tied to an external threat, right? And in fact, there just don't happen to be as many external threats. As we leave the Cold War era, as we talked about in the Levitsky and Way argument, as you get past the Cold War, the new order, the new international order, starts respecting boundaries and wants to limit interstate conflict, and that taking territory or using wars to extract wealth is just not really a functional aspect. And so maybe that war pressure did work for England and France and other places, but that was a relic of that time. And 20th century and 21st century state building happens in a very different way. And so we're going to talk about that at the beginning of the next class, because I want to talk about something else real quick. If you turn in, I think I gave you another week or 10 days or something like that, that if you turn your paper in early, I will read it, I'll review it, I'll explain what grade I'm giving it, and then you can resubmit it up until the deadline. Typically what happens is my A students who are already A students will send me a B plus A minus paper, and then they will keep resubmitting until they get 100%. That's typically what happens. That's not really why I have you guys submit early. There are a lot of students who are sort of struggling. But I don't have this, well, you failed, now you're in trouble. I have this, you should be allowed to fail, you should be allowed to struggle, and then after, through the struggle, you should learn more and be more successful. So one of the things is if you turn in the paper early, and it's an A minus paper, and the extra credit would make it sort of A minus A, then I don't let you. Once you get to 18 out of 20, you're not allowed to resubmit, just because it's definitely a headache to have sort of an A student fight me over 1 or 2 points when they're going to get an A either way. So those students who get an 18 out of 20 or higher, right, that's going to be your cutoff. I'm going to say, yes, there are things you could do to improve your paper, here are the things there are, but don't resubmit, and I'll make that very clear. For those of you that have been struggling, look at the criteria of the paper. Pick some articles that you like. Some of them are only 10 pages long. Find the ones that you can sort of build an argument. Get into the details. Write me a 5-page paper. Show me using the rubric, because the rubric is posted. Read through it. Answer to the best of your ability. And then within a day or two, I will give you a clear review of that paper, and you can resubmit 8, 10 times if you want. As long as you keep giving me work, and that's 20% of your grade, then as long as you put the work in, you can get full credit. So even if you did poorly on the first 2 exams, right, you could still be in a very good position to get an A or a B, right? That I will always provide those opportunities. So make sure you're looking at this, think about the paper. The other part is if you're missing any assignments or an extra credit other than the first 2 exams, do them, right? You have an extra credit opportunity with the Fuller article, right? Read through those. The only thing that I want to mention is that in the Fuller article, if you just pull from other people's comments and you don't really read it, it's very obvious and you're not going to get a lot out of that. And in the exams, there were some statements that were repeated 5 or 6 times. And so it's clear that you're sort of discussing the exam, either why you're taking it or after the fact, right? But there is some clear sort of group prep. Now that's not actually cheating, right? Before the exam, before you take the exam, if you want to sit down in a group and discuss what might be on the exam and what the review is covering and discuss possible things, then that's not really cheating, right? That's just you reviewing as you study, and I want you to study. What I would like you to do is make sure that you're checking on what people are saying. Because I had about 4 students say that the United States had state-run media. And historically, that is very, very inaccurate, right? To the point of sort of as inaccurate as it can be, right? In the 20th century, when airwaves were a thing, when you saw broadcasts over airwaves, the United States, unlike almost all the other countries, said we're going to have our own radio station, or we're going to have our own TV station, and we're going to benefit financially from it. And the United States, for whatever reason, definitely not generosity, maybe they didn't understand what they had, or I don't know. But the United States said the airwaves are private companies to use however they want. And then it triggers this weird, there's a show that used to be on, I think, Newsroom, or I think it's called Newsroom. It was an old show, it was basically satire. But he sort of comments on this, that the United States just said, no, The airwaves are yours. They're the people's. Any company that produces equipment that can broadcast over these airwaves, if you build a building that has a broadcast antenna, you can broadcast. And that's yours. It's free, right? And you have to make sure that you're not broadcasting over someone else, and we're going to make rules about how to broadcast. But the airwaves and what becomes sort of the digital landscape later on, right, about different channels and cable versus dish, right? As long as you're not harming anyone or you're not stepping on someone else's broadcast, you guys do whatever you want. The only requirement is there has to be a news channel, right? Why don't all the channels have their own news station? Because it used to be a requirement for broadcast channels over the air. And so enough of you mentioned this that you were missing something there. And someone must have said, oh, look at this state media or this point of state media. But it happened enough where it was clear that you had discussed it, but hadn't really critically analyzed it. Because some of you went to another point and said, well, there are these very skewed channels. But Dahl talks about alternative sources. For every Fox News, there's an MSNBC, right? You have Alex Jones, right, which is sort of far right and maybe a little skewed. But on the other side, you have people who are buying real water. Right? And real water was a horrific idea, right? You have anti-vaxxers on the left as much as you have, climate change deniers on the right. That both sides, they might seem skewed, but they're sort of balanced in their skew, right? There's no one in the middle, there's very little moderates left in the middle, but it's not state-run, it's not state-driven, it just so happens that this side has one view and this has another view, right? And if you look at MSNBC, they've already been softer on Biden on some things that they would have really gone on Trump. And Fox News was much softer on Trump than they're going to be on Biden, right? That's not skewed, that's playing to your base, right? Remember, these aren't state-run, these are companies. Fox News is making its money through ads to mostly older people, right? And speaking to that right, typically white, older conservative, right? And the ads that are running on CNN and MSNBC are to a different demographic, right? It's still white. It's not that much younger, right? But it has a slightly different lean. And so they're appealing to those audiences. In the same way that I might watch anime or cartoons or any other shows that aren't ridiculous, right? But I'm watching those shows doesn't mean the state is controlling what I'm watching, right? The choices are up to me, right? I can watch Downton Abbey, or I can watch, South Park, right? Those are my options. So it's not state-run media, even if it is biased, because you can just change the channel, right? And so that point about just critically thinking, using that example to say, right, make sure that you look into what you're discussing and look at the material to see if it's really backed by that. Because none of you are going to remember, very clearly, none of you are going to remember most of this course, right? That's not something, memorization in this course is not really what I want. That's why I always try to avoid multiple choice questions, but because I'm not here in the classroom with you, I'm worried that I'm not providing you enough clear testable material. But what you need to pull from this is definitely, how do I think about this? How do I approach this critically? And how do I approach this logically? And how do I look at the arguments and see if they have validity to them, right? And that is a primary goal. When we talk about war pressure, when we talk about identity later on, you're going to have a strong rejection to some of these, right? When I talk about an identity formation and the way that identity formation, you're going to be like, that's not real. My identity isn't formed by my parents and by my environment. I have agency. I decide my identity. Maybe not, right? Science doesn't think that that's true, right? That there's behavioralism, right? That there's all these beliefs that your genetics, right? Your background, the water you drink, the temperature of the climate that you live in, right? Those all play on who you are as a person. So you're going to have rejections to that, and it's going to be an ability that you have to create where you can say, okay, here are my emotional rejections, and here are my logical rejections, and are they different, and are my emotional rejections not in line with my logic, right? And so that's going to help that critical thought process, and I want you to remember that much more than I want you to remember the details. I just have to have details to test you on so I can give you a grade, right? There's a grade goal, and then there's a learning goal. So I went over a little bit. There's still plenty of time for those of you to recover. There's still plenty of time for the people who have an A not to get an A, right? I had a student who didn't turn in the paper. They had almost 100%, and then they did turn in the paper, and then that A grade becomes a B minus C plus because they didn't turn in 20% of their grade, right? And so make sure that you're staying on top of it. And if you need me, I am available a lot. I can do WebEx. I have a webcam. I don't have a computer in my house right now because it's still broken, or it's at the manufacturer. Who knows when they ship it back? But I can always come onto campus. I can always get into an office. I can always communicate with you in some way to give you some clarity. So I hope you guys have a great Friday. I will see you soon. Thank you very much.